Thank you so much. Okay. All right. How's everyone doing? Where's everyone else? Well. Okay, so we're continuing on. I think that so what next Thursday is our lecture exam. Thursday. Calendar here. Yeah. Next Thursday is our lecture exam 2. I think we're going to wrap up all of our information for that this week. I don't want to get out the water. So I think we'll get through the open versus closed circulatory system today, and we'll wrap things up on Thursday. So then next Tuesday will just be a review before lecture exam. No new information. And then we'll do our lecture exam on Thursday. And then for lab, we have a cockroach section today. And then I have a couple things I want to try to do for the lab exam on the 31st. But probably what will happen here is the 29th will be going over, I'll grade the exam, we'll go over it on the 29th, and then we'll have time to review for the lab exam. So we're kind of like, we'll be riding out the rest of October here with just those 2 exams. And we'll get a first start in November.
It was like
Let's see here. Sound good? Is he great?
It's awesome.
Questions?
They're not necessary.
And like I said before, there's the Halloween
These ones
costume contest
right.
at the lecture, at the lab exam.
It's all the arrows. It's like all the arrows and periods. Yeah, that one's rematched. I'm not sure that 100%. That one's a bummer because there's so much information. It's like, what information is he looking for? Like, this one mentions jawfish. This one also mentions jawfish. Where do they? Yeah. Maybe I'll ask my
Okay, any questions? Looking
Reed
good?
has a lot of good
So,
charts,
the
visual
theme
things
we've done
for
so
the
far
creatures and the
is
periods.
I've looked
So,
at
I don't know.
all the organisms that we've seen up to now with regards, feeding adaptations, and then respiratory adaptations, and then, of course, why respiration is necessary. And then we looked at nitrogenous waste excretion adaptations, and then kind of the overlying thing is how do they maintain water balance in saltwater versus freshwater. And we kind of alluded a little bit to terrestrial, but I think we'll do terrestrial physiology for probably the next lecture exam. But anyway, so I mentioned last time when we talked about the annelids, which had this circulatory system which is separate from their coelom. The annelids use their coelom for locomotion, for movement. They're using like a hydrostatic skeleton. And then they had a circulatory system to move nutrients and oxygen and wastes around the body. It was separate. And then over here, I drew the mollusk situation. And mollusks have a little different plan, where they had a lot of the same parts that the annelid had, but their circulatory system and their coelom were kind of combined together, right? That's kind of our theme here, is what we're going to call open versus closed circulatory systems. And then we're going to circle back and look at respiratory treatments, because there seems to be kind of a pattern that organisms that have one circulatory system tend to have one type of respiratory treatment. Okay? And if you need chapter numbers, basically covering these kind of physiological chapters, but it's really just the first couple pages, the first 5 pages here and the first 5 pages contains there. And so usually that's what it's first. Okay, so let's go ahead. I'll draw this out here, and let's see. Just use this first. So let's go ahead and look at what I would call an open circulatory system. I'm going to kind of diagram it as a model. So if we have the organism coelom here, kind of their body cavity has kind of a diagram here. What an open circulatory system is all about here is where the let's go ahead and just draw it and then I'll elaborate on here. It kind of reminds me of like if you've ever had an aquarium at home that had like a recirculation pump in it. Like you got the aquarium where you keep your fish and they're swimming around in the water tank. But then you have one of these little lift pumps that kind of pulls water up, puts it through a filter, and then kind of dumps it back into the aquarium. That's kind of what an open circulatory system is all about. So this is our open circulatory system. Okay? So, a couple key features of the open circulatory system is we have this cavity here, which is the coelom, is combined together with the circulatory system. So this cavity has a special name called a hemocoel. So what the hemocoel is a coelom plus circulatory system combined together. You're going to find that that some sources, like if you look at this online, hemo can also be spelled H-E-M, hemo, it looks like hemo, but that's just like the British or English spelling, British English spelling. Hemo, H-E-M-O is more of the American English spelling, so don't get confused. I'm not misspelling it because there's actually 2 ways to spell hemocoel. So anyway, the hemocoel basically is the coelom and circulatory system combined. And in that hemocoel, there is what's called hemolymph. And hemolymph, as the name implies, hemo means blood, and lymph means, in your lymphatic fluid is all the water that's around your cells and it kind of circulates outside your circulatory system. So your lymph is essentially kind of your body fluid. Let's go ahead and call it body fluid that's not blood. So anyway, and really what lymph is your coelomic fluid, the fluid that's in your coelom. So what we're saying here is the hemolymph is both of these are blended together. So what happens here is we have, I guess you could call this a heart. I'll put it in quotes because as we saw with, I think it was the crayfish was a good example of this, that when you look at the heart of the crayfish, crawdad, it was really kind of a loose bag. It wasn't really like a muscular pump, like you think of a heart, like a vertebrate heart, or even like the hearts that we saw in the segment tumors that were kind of muscular and moving thing. These hearts are just kind of like a loose, kind of very weakly musculated pump that will pump the blood fluid around the body. So what's going on here is the blood fluid is essentially just kind of recirculated from the heart into the hemocoel and collected back into the heart. And so oftentimes, the name given for this heart, and you've heard me say this, is pericardium. And the pericardium just kind of implies that it's not really a muscular pump, it's more of like just a membrane that contains the blood fluid. I keep using this plastic bag as kind of an example because to me that's what the heart of the crayfish or the mollusk looks like. It's just like a plastic bag. Okay, so we have an open circulatory system. There's a hemocoel, which is a combined circulatory and blood cavity. If we look at like at the let's see here, we have hemolymph, which is a mixed circulatory fluid. If we look at the pressure of the system, because the largest cavity of the body is the hemocoel versus the heart, which is the smaller cavity or sinus, this is a very low pressure. So what we have going on here is what would we say is like not negative pressure, but let's put it all right, low pressure. So the system really doesn't operate much really on pressure. It's more on just kind of like passive circulation. And probably I would say that in the mollusks and the arthropods, more circulation is done by the appendages than is done by the heart. So in the mollusk, like let's say for example the squid, they get quite a bit of circulation done by contracting the mantle or pushing their tentacles in and out, which is what hemolymph is used to push tentacles out. They probably get more circulation in their body from body movement. Certainly with the crayfish, when they move their legs, they're basically pumping blood fluid through their hemolymph, through their gills and through their body. So, so the system is very low pressure. I kind of think of it like as the hemolymph just kind of sloshing around in there. And, there's advantages and disadvantages to that. Because the system is low pressure, it's kind of a low energy. There's not a lot of energy involved in pumping the heart muscle. Again, because most of the circulation is done by body movement or just the hemolymph sloshing around, it's kind of a low energy cost to this system. Okay, we'll come back on the positives and negatives in a second. The organisms that tend to have this system would be, we were looking at probably like mollusks, mollusca, and arthropoda are the two main organisms that we think of that have an open circulatory system. All right, let's go ahead then and draw a closed circulatory system here to compare it to. All right. So in a closed circulatory system, so how this one works here, usually the heart in the circulatory system is the largest sinus cavity. We go ahead and draw it, and I'll elaborate on about it here in a second. So we have a heart. Get this a little better portion here. And we have what I'm going to call a capillary bed. I'll label it. Outline and then we can talk about it. Okay, so in this organism, in the open circulatory system, one of the main things here is they have a coelom, which is a body cavity that is separate from the circulatory cavity. So, so the coelom and circulatory is separate. So in this case, we have lymph or coelomic fluid and blood are not mixed. They're being completely separate systems, so they don't mix together. Okay, so in this case, usually the heart is a true heart because it actually ends up having a more muscular function, and the pressure in this system is high. And the reason why this is a high pressure system is usually you have a heart that's the largest cavity of the circulatory system, and then we have a capillary bed, which is where oxygen can be diffused to tissues, or nutrients can be absorbed, or you basically have exchange of oxygen level in the capillary bed. So because the capillary bed is usually very small blood vessels compared to the heart, the arterial system, or the system that's basically delivering blood, we'll talk about arteries versus veins later, but the system that's delivering blood to the capillary bed tends to be at a very high pressure. And then the system that's collecting the blood to go back to the heart is a lower pressure. But overall, the entire system is at a higher pressure than it is with the open circulatory system. Okay, as such, the high pressure requires quite a bit more metabolic energy. There's more energy required to pump this fluid at a high pressure. The organisms that have this system tend to be more the annelids, annelida, and the vertebrates. Vertebrates, chordates, basically fishes and anything with backbone, vertebrata, post-circulatory. Okay, so that's kind of the pattern there. I know we've talked about sponges and jellyfish, flatworms and nematodes. They don't really count because those organisms didn't really have a true coelom. So what we're talking about is organisms that have a true coelom with regard to whether they have an open versus closed system. But what I would say is organisms that we've seen that didn't have a true coelom probably resemble more of an open system. They didn't have a true heart type structure and a separated body fluid. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look here. I think we've covered everything here. I'll come back to that endothelium thing in a second. So we've got circulatory fluid. In the open system, it's called a hemolymph. It's a mixture of the body fluid or interstitial fluid, coelomic fluid, and blood that combine together. And low pressure. We'll come back to the risks in a second. With the closed circulatory system, we have a separate coelom and circulatory fluid. What this is caused by is the separated fluid is caused because there is an endothelium. It's an endothelium line system. And what that means, we're actually going to cover animal cells and tissues in the lab next week. But what endothelium line means is that there is basically a membrane that surrounds the basement membrane that lines this whole system such that the blood cells can't leak out, they can't seep out, except for maybe right at the capillary. That's where they're, these oxygen and nutrients are delivered to the tissues. So what causes the blood to stay in the circulatory system is this endothelium. So I added that to the right-hand side. Blood vessels are lined with endothelium. And that's gonna be kind of a key thing when we talk about squids here in a second. Okay, so I think we've covered everything. I think the best thing to look at, which I think is always fun, is which one's better. Like, you know, what are the advantages and disadvantages of each? And so that's pretty interesting to look at. We could say that for energy cost, so energy, that this is, I don't know, let's go ahead and say that, how do I say this? It's like, it's high energy versus low energy, but which one's the advantage? I mean, the less energy you have to spend on your physiology, probably the better. So I would say that organisms that have a closed system have to invest a lot more energy into it. Organisms that have an open system don't need to invest as much food energy or metabolic energy into their circulatory system. So you imagine that, like, say for example, a crayfish doesn't have to probably feed as much as maybe a leech, for example. The idea there is that if you have a lower energy requirement, you don't have to invest as much of your resources into it. So I'd say in that case, maybe there's an advantage to an open system with that low energy versus the closed system at higher energy. There's also the efficiency. And what that means is, how efficient are you at transferring, for example, gases, oxygen, CO2? How efficient are you transferring nutrients and waste, like carbohydrates versus urea or nitrogenous waste? And it tends to be that closed circulatory systems tend to have a higher efficiency at being able to transfer oxygen and nutrients. So we can put it that way. And then the risk, meaning the risk of bleeding or the risk of, if you have damage to your system, which one is going to be more problematic. And so in that case, I would say that that if an organism that has a closed circulatory system gets injured, that breaks that endothelium, the risk of bleeding is pretty high. So these organisms have a greater risk of bleeding out. And if they get injured, they might not recover and they would die from the injury. Whereas organisms with an open circulatory system can tend to repair the damage a little more effectively. I mean, a squid can lose a tentacle and not bleed to death, and they'd be able to kind of recover from that. So in the terms of the risk, I don't know. I'm going to change this from plus to minus because I think that's a little deceiving. What I'm going to say is I'll put an arrow towards which one has the advantage, right? The energy probably gives it to the open circulatory system, meaning it's low energy versus high. So I'll put an arrow saying that probably the energy factor is favoring the open circulatory system. The efficiency is favoring the closed circulatory system. Does that make more sense? So there's a high efficiency versus a low efficiency. The risk, I think, favors the open circulatory system, meaning that if that organism gets injured, they're likely not going to bleed to death, whereas the closed circulatory system has a high, so low risk and a high risk of injury causing death. Okay, so it seems like, I guess what I'm trying to argue here is there's positives and negatives to both systems. But really, I think what it amounts to is if you are a small, relatively inactive organism a open circulatory system is probably your best bet. And 10 million species of insects can't be wrong. The greatest diversity of animal life, I'm gonna go ahead and say 85% of all animal species basically are mollusks and arthropods, right? So this system seems to work really well when you're small and relatively inactive. And I say that with hesitation because if you look at an insect, insects are very active. But the thing is they're able to go for long periods of time with no activity. Like when it's cold out, you know, many insects can just hunker down, not move, not feed. They kind of go into a temporary state of hibernation. And they can achieve that because they're not spending much energy maintaining their metabolism. Whereas if you're large and very active and or active, a closed circulatory system is probably favored, right? And annelids and vertebrates make up a good amount of diversity, but nothing even close to what mollusks and arthropods have before. Right? So, probably, and there will be on the exam a question that says, compare and contrast a open versus closed circulatory system. So I would hope that you'd be able to at least provide kind of a model diagram that shows the two. A little sketch or a little diagram outlining the systems would be great. And then I'm going to ask you, what are the advantages and disadvantages of both types? And so in addition to comparing the open versus closed system, again, one of the definitions is in an open system, the blood fluids and the body fluid, the interstitial fluid, is mixed together as a hemoglobin in the hemocoel. Whereas in a closed system, the blood and body fluid are separated because of this endothelium lining that lines the blood vessels and capillaries. That is the definition of open versus closed circulatory system. And then if you could go on to imply that in terms of energy, efficiency, and risk, you know, each of them has their advantages and disadvantages. And really, ultimately, what happens is small inactive organisms, like insects and many mollusks, or arthropods and mollusks, tend to favor this open circulatory system, whereas larger and more active organisms tend to favor a more closed circulatory system. So this is kind of like an overview. That PowerPoint is available online as well, so it kind of says the same thing as this diagram. It's a little simpler. Okay? All right. So, any questions? Plan on that for a test question. You can probably practice that, but I would hope that for sure the things I'm looking for are to note that in the open system we have a combination of the two circulatory and solvent structures. Hemocoel and hemolymph are a mixture of the two systems, and then in the closed circular system we have them separated, and that's what leads to kind of these benefits. All right, I'm gonna. Let's go ahead and talk about blood pigments for a moment here. Both of these organisms that have these open versus closed circulatory systems have usually respiratory pigments. And I mentioned this last time. There's 4 different kinds of respiratory pigments that occur in animals. I'm just going to focus on 2 of them. And the 2 I'm going to focus on are hemoglobin. So organisms with a closed circulatory system tend to favor hemoglobin. And what hemoglobin has, and I think this is the one that actually has the spelling, H-E-M, hemoglobin, which is the British spelling. So it basically spells both ways, whether it's British English or American English. This is the more common for American. Hemoglobin. Hemoglobin basically is an iron compound, iron ion. And what that does is it grabs onto oxygen, basically oxidizing the iron. So the reason why hemoglobin, your blood, is red when oxidized is because essentially the iron being oxidized is what the color of rust is. So, when you see like your old garden tools sitting outside turning orange or red in the wintertime when they're wet and oxidized, that's because iron is being oxidized. It's the same chemical process that your blood cell uses to carry oxygen. Whereas in organisms with an open circulatory system, they have a pigment called hemocyanin. And hemocyanin is a copper-based oxygen carrier. And one of the big differences is in hemocyanin, it takes 2 coppers to carry 1 oxygen. So in terms of kind of chemical efficiency, you can see that hemoglobin is a little bit more efficient, whereas it's 1 iron ion to carry 1 oxygen. Here we need kind of a pair of coppers to carry 1 oxygen, right? So that's kind of one difference. The other difference is when these are oxidized, it's blue. So this is why when you cut the squid open, you didn't really see any red come out, because the blood pigment, when it's oxidized, is blue. And of course it was dead, so it wasn't really very well oxidized. That's really common among arthropods and mollusks. They have this kind of blue blood oxidized. Okay, the other 2 pigments I'm not going to worry about. Chlorocoronin and hemerythrin. These are found in kind of polychaete worms and brachiopods, which we'll talk about later. But those are both iron-based compounds, but they're not as efficient as hemoglobin. Kind of like oddball, weird organisms that have those. So of the organisms that have circulatory pigments, blood pigments, 95% of the species have either hemoglobin or hemocyanin. So we'll focus on those and not worry about the others. The others use an iron compound as well. Okay, so what are the advantages and disadvantages? This is what I'm mentioning here was hemoglobin is 1 iron for 1 oxygen. Hemocyanin is 2 iron for 1 oxygen. Hemerythrin and chlorocoronin are kind of like a hybrid of the 2. But I'm not going to ask you anything about hemerythrin or chlorocoronin. We're going to focus on just hemocyanin and hemoglobin. So then, the question then is, which one's better? And it depends. If the temperatures are very cold and the oxygen levels are very low, hemocyanin wins. So in this case, the advantage is, let me see if I can use a good pen color here. At low temperature, meaning like near freezing, below 4 degrees Celsius, near freezing, at low temperature and low oxygen levels, meaning if the oxygen is less than saturated, hemocyanin actually is a better blood pigment. And this makes sense, like all the mollusks and arthropods that live deep in the ocean, there tends to be essentially very, very cold temperatures, less than 4 degrees Celsius, almost freezing. And sometimes oxygen levels can be depressed because of decomposition and respiration. Yeah, so basically they're kind of like oxygen-starved environments. In those situations, hemocyanin is better at picking up and carrying oxygen than hemoglobin. But hemoglobin, if it's a higher temperature, meaning between 4 degrees and 15 degrees or 20 degrees, like warm temperature, hemoglobin is better at carrying oxygen. And at higher oxygen level, meaning if oxygen is near saturation, hemoglobin is better at carrying the oxygen. So again, as a trade-off, if you are living in cold, not so oxygen-rich environments, hemocyanin is your pigment. If you're living in warmer climates or warmer habitats that have, oxygen near saturation, hemoglobin is more efficient. So that's kind of the trade-off there. So on the exam, I'll have probably a separate question that asks you to compare and contrast hemoglobin versus hemocyanin. And you're going to have to do something about iron versus the 1 iron versus the 2 coppers. That's one key thing. You're going to have to tell me about the red monoxidized versus blue monoxidized. That's another key thing. And you probably should tell me what kinds of organisms have each. Versus annelids or arthropods versus vertebrates. Just kind of giving a general idea that you understand which types of organisms have them. And in general, the benefits are that when it's cold and oxygen starved, hemocyanin wins, whereas when it's higher temperatures and lots of oxygen, hemoglobin wins. Okay, so I want to finish out here talking about kind of a controversial area of biology, and I think this is fun though. So if you look at your textbook and you look at the circulatory system chapter, what it'll say is open circulatory systems are found in arthropods and most mollusks. And then it'll say closed circulatory systems are found in vertebrates, annelids, and some mollusks. Or what they mean is cephalopod mollusks. So what the book chapter will say, and many online resources will say, is that the cephalopod, squids and octopus namely, they will say that squids and octopus have a closed circulatory system. And, but I'm going to argue that's not true. And we're going to kind of make an exception or we're going to present why I would say that cephalopods, we're talking about squids here, really have an open circulatory system that's modified to look like a closed system. Okay, let me go ahead and draw a squid here, and we'll take a look at what that means. So here's our squid, and tentacles here. So what they had going on here in the squid was, if you remember, we had 3 different hearts, right? We had let me go ahead and use green here for the cnidia. We had the cnidia, which were the gills, had at the base of them a branchial heart. Branchial hearts and cnidia. And then we had the systemic heart was something like this. Systemic heart. That's I think that's kind of how I drew it. Okay, so what's going on here is the squids have a pair of branchial hearts and then one systemic heart, and the blood fluid is circulated through both of these. So what happens in the cnidia is because squids are large organisms, the ones that we dissected were actually pretty big by invertebrate standards. They're like, 10 inches, a foot long. That's pretty big for an invertebrate. But you know that squids, like the Humboldt squid, can be 3 feet, 4 feet long. The giant squid can be 20, 30 feet long. Their mantle's as long as this table. So they're a very large invertebrate, and they're super active, right? I showed the video, and they're swimming pretty fast. And I think they can reach speeds like 20 miles per hour in short bursts. They're a super active predator. So because they're large and active, an open circulatory system is compromising their ability to do their respiration. So what they do is the cnidia, where the respiration happens, has their own high pressure heart system. And so what happens here is the hemolymph is circulating through the cnidia using the branchial heart, and this is at a high pressure. So the hemolymph, the blood fluid, is circulated in the cnidia at a high pressure, pumped by this branchial heart. And what that does is it improves their efficiency, because the cnidia operates like a capillary bed, and so they're essentially using like an accessory pump to have a high pressure that occurs in the cnidia. But then when the blood is returned to the systemic heart, it circulates through the body of the squid at low pressure. So the blood fluid, rich with oxygen and nutrients, then is delivered to the body organs in a hemocoel at kind of a relatively low pressure. So it's like they have a hybrid of the two systems, right? They have like an open circulatory system and a closed system kind of combined together. But what I'm going to argue here, if I will, is that really what this is, it's an open circulatory system. And the reason is the blood vessels are not completely lined with endothelium, and the blood fluid is a mixture of hemolymph, basically. So because these have a hemolymph, and there is, and the reason why they have hemolymph is because there is no lining of the circulatory system by endothelium. Really what this is, and the other thing to think about, is the ancestor of squids, which would be other mollusks, the hypothetical ancestral mollusk. Mollusks in general, the primitive mollusks, all have an open circulatory system. The squid would have had to inherit and modify that typical mollusk circulatory system. So my argument is that it's an open circulatory system, and here's your right answer for the test. It's an open circulatory system that's been modified to function like a closed circulatory system, right? They've adapted their open circulatory system to resemble the closed circulatory system. They also have hemocyanin as their blood pigment. So it seems like everything they have is geared toward open. It's just that the cnidia have a high pressure circuit. And the blood pressure in like a Humboldt squid is close to what like blood pressure of a vertebrate is. So it is approaching the same types of blood pressures that systolic or diastolic blood pressure are likely to have, depending on the size of the organ. So super efficient. Other organisms that do this kind of thing are like Alaskan king crabs or Maine lobster. Large arthropods, like a lobster, which is like a big crayfish, they have their gills are at the base of their legs, and when they move their legs, they actually pump their hemolymph through the gills at a higher pressure. We don't really call that hearts, we call it a skeletal pump, but they're actually operating the same system where at the gill, they have a high pressure that kind of resembles a closed system. But ultimately, I'm going to argue that this is truly an open circulatory system because we have a mixture of hemolymph and in the body cavity, it's more of a low pressure system. Got it? So I think this is kind of an interesting controversy. You'll find that kind of entry level or beginning biology textbooks like we're using oversimplify the system. But if you think about it in terms of physiology and evolution, it kind of makes it more clear that this is just a super modified open system. It's kind of like a, what do we call that? Analogous trait. It's analogous to a closed system. So it's basically adapting to a closed system function, but has no common. So, there will be a test question following the question about compare and contrast open versus closed circulatory systems. The question will be, verbatim, is how have squid modified their circulatory system? And your best answer is to share that they have an open circulatory system that has a gill circuit that resembles a closed circulatory system. And then they can give you some information as to why you call it open versus closed. So it's high pressure, which resembles closed, but ultimately, because we have a mixture of blood fluids and sloman fluids, hemolymph, there's no endothelium lining, as I've written in there. It's truly an open circulatory system that's been modified. All right? Okay, I think that's going to be it for today. Any questions? So make sure you get a picture of the board. That PowerPoint's available online. And let's go ahead and take a long break here, a little after 9 o'clock. We're going to have a cockroach session today. That's not a fun one. And I have to go get my stuff to take care of. All right, there you go. Questions? Good? Okay, see you in a bit. There you go.